Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the rules of reality have quietly changed overnight. Gravity still works, mostly, but now you can double jump over puddles during your commute. When you stub your toe, a tiny red health bar appears above your head. And if you make an embarrassing mistake, like spilling coffee on your boss during a meeting, you simply respawn a few minutes earlier and try again. It sounds convenient, almost magical. On a cold morning in London, Daniel Hayes experienced exactly that. As he stepped out of his apartment and rushed toward the bus stop, he jumped over a puddle, and somehow jumped again while still in midair. At first, he laughed. It felt like the world had suddenly turned into a video game. Before this strange shift, Daniel's life had been perfectly ordinary. He worked in a marketing office, attended meetings that lasted longer than necessary, and relied heavily on coffee to survive Monday mornings. Like many people in both the UK and the US, he believed he was meant for something bigger but hadn't quite figured out what that something was yet. In storytelling, this is what we call the ordinary world, the calm, predictable place where the hero exists before the adventure begins. Daniel didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a tired professional trying to keep up with deadlines. Then the adventure truly began. On his way to work that morning, Daniel saw something impossible. A jogger tripped on the pavement, vanished for a second, and reappeared a few steps back as if the mistake had been undone. A cyclist bumped into a street sign and instantly respawned at the corner, perfectly unharmed. Above people's heads floated faint energy bars that seemed to represent stamina. Reality had adopted video game physics. News quickly spread across the world, from London to New York City. At first, people were thrilled. Mistakes no longer carried permanent consequences. Failure became temporary. Soon the entire world began experimenting. Commuters double-jumped over subway barriers. Athletes performed gravity-defying moves that would have seemed impossible just days before. Office workers saved progress before big presentations so they could redo them perfectly if something went wrong. For a while, life became easier and far more entertaining. Daniel even started enjoying work more, knowing that any awkward moment could simply be reset. The excitement was real, and the possibilities seemed endless. But slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Because mistakes could be undone, people stopped taking things seriously. Deadlines lost urgency. Projects dragged on because everyone believed they could simply fix problems later. Friends postponed decisions because they always had another chance. Daniel noticed the change in himself as well. Without real consequences, his motivation faded. Fear of failure had once pushed him to try harder, but now that fear was gone, and so was his sense of urgency. This was the true turning point in Daniel's journey. In storytelling terms, it was the moment when the hero realizes the real challenge isn't what it first seemed. The strange physics of the world wasn't the real problem. Human behavior was. When failure became harmless, achievement also lost its meaning. Daniel realized that risk is what gives success its value. One evening, Daniel stood on a rooftop watching the city lights stretch across the skyline. People were jumping between buildings just for fun, laughing as if life were a game. It looked exciting, but something about it felt empty. That's when Daniel made a simple but powerful decision. He stopped relying on respawns. He stopped saving progress before every risk. Instead, he chose to live as if mistakes still mattered. Surprisingly, everything changed. When he took work seriously again, his focus improved. When he accepted the possibility of failure, his efforts felt meaningful. Fear returned, but this time it wasn't an enemy. It was a reminder that effort matters. Daniel finally understood something most people overlook: the challenges of real life are not flaws in the system. They are what make progress meaningful. If life truly worked like a video game, the hardest challenge wouldn't be survival, it would be maintaining purpose. And perhaps the real lesson of Daniel's strange adventure is this: the limitations of reality are not obstacles. They are the very reason achievement feels worthwhile. Before the strange glitch in reality, Daniel Hayes lived what most people would call a perfectly ordinary life. He worked at a marketing firm in a busy office district, spending most of his days in meetings that everyone secretly knew could have been emails. His mornings began the same way almost every weekday: alarm ringing too early, coffee brewing too slowly, and the quiet promise that today would be the day he finally got ahead. Like many professionals across the UK and the US, Daniel measured his productivity in cups of coffee and unfinished to-do lists. His commute through London was predictable. Crowded buses, quiet commuters staring at their phones, and the occasional drizzle that seemed permanently attached to the city skyline. Daniel often stood near the window, watching the streets pass by while imagining a different version of his life. In his mind, he was destined for something more exciting than spreadsheets and status meetings. Yet every evening he returned to the same small apartment, telling himself that someday things would change. Daniel wasn't unhappy exactly, just restless. He had ambition, ideas, and a quiet belief that he could do something meaningful if he ever found the right opportunity. But like many people trying to build a life in a busy city, he was also dealing with practical realities: rent payments, deadlines, and the subtle pressure to keep everything stable. Those responsibilities had a way of shrinking even the biggest dreams. At the office, Daniel had built a reputation as the dependable one. He delivered his projects on time, helped colleagues when presentations went wrong, and stayed late whenever the team needed extra support. His boss appreciated him, though rarely in a dramatic way. Instead, Daniel received the occasional nod of approval or a polite email thanking him for maintaining consistent performance. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. Safety, however, has an interesting side effect. It can slowly make life feel smaller. Daniel noticed that most of his co-workers had settled into similar routines. They talked about promotions and long-term plans, but the conversations always circled back to the same topics: office politics, weekend plans, and whether the coffee machine would survive another week. Everyone seemed busy, yet somehow nothing truly changed. Sometimes, during lunch breaks, Daniel would scroll through social media and see stories of entrepreneurs launching companies, travelers exploring distant countries, and creators building new careers. These images sparked a mixture of inspiration and skepticism. Part of him felt excited by the possibilities, but another part quietly wondered whether those stories were as simple as they appeared online. This tension between imagination and reality is exactly what storytellers call the ordinary world in the hero's journey. It's the stage where the hero lives before the adventure begins. Everything feels normal, even comfortable, but there's a subtle sense that something bigger is waiting just beyond the horizon. For Daniel, that feeling appeared every time he stared out at the city skyline and asked himself the same question: is this really all there is? He didn't realize it yet, but this ordinary routine was actually preparing him for something unexpected. The long hours had built discipline. The frustrating meetings had taught patience. The quiet restlessness inside him had created curiosity about what else life might offer. In many ways, the calm, repetitive rhythm of his life was the foundation for the transformation that would soon arrive. Because every hero's journey begins in a place like this, an environment that feels normal enough to ignore, yet meaningful enough to shape the person standing in it. Daniel didn't know it, but the adventure that would challenge everything he believed about effort, risk, and purpose was already beginning to form. And like most great stories, it would start on a completely ordinary morning. Then came the moment that changed everything. It started as an ordinary inconvenience. Daniel missed his bus. In a city like London, missing the bus usually means standing in the rain for 15 minutes while questioning every decision that brought you to that exact moment. The sky was gray, the pavement was wet, and Daniel was already running late for work. As he hurried across the street, he jumped over a large puddle near the curb. But something strange happened. While still in the air, he felt a sudden burst of momentum and instinctively jumped again, mid-air. A perfect second jump. Daniel landed safely on the other side of the street and froze. For a few seconds he simply stared at the pavement, trying to understand what had just happened. Double jumping wasn't supposed to be possible. Physics had rules. Gravity had rules. Yet there he was, standing perfectly balanced after performing something that should only exist inside a video game. At first he assumed it was adrenaline. Maybe he had imagined it. But as he looked around, he noticed something even stranger. A jogger passed by, and floating above the runner's head was a small glowing green bar that slowly drained as the jogger continued moving. It looked exactly like a stamina meter from a video game. Daniel blinked several times, wondering if he needed more sleep or less coffee. Before he could process what he was seeing, a cyclist nearby clipped the edge of the sidewalk and lost balance. The bike tipped over gently, and for a moment Daniel expected the usual chaos of a minor accident. Instead, the cyclist flickered out of existence for a split second and instantly reappeared about 10 feet back on the road, riding forward again as if nothing had happened. Daniel stared in disbelief. Reality had quietly changed. The world around him was behaving exactly like a video game. For the next few minutes, Daniel watched the street like a scientist observing a strange experiment. A commuter tripped slightly while rushing across the road and briefly disappeared before reappearing a few steps earlier, continuing their walk with no sign that anything unusual had occurred. Another pedestrian casually double-jumped over a low barrier as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No one seemed particularly alarmed. People were confused, yes, but also amused. Phones were already coming out as commuters recorded videos of their new abilities. Within minutes, social media exploded with clips of people testing the strange new physics. News alerts began appearing on phones everywhere. Across the world, similar reports were emerging. In New York City, commuters were jumping over subway gates without touching them. Athletes discovered they could leap far higher than before. Minor accidents simply reset themselves like a saved checkpoint in a game. For a moment, the world felt strangely magical. Daniel couldn't help laughing. The absurdity of it all was impossible to ignore. A lifetime of video games had prepared him for this moment better than any physics class ever could. He tried jumping again, this time intentionally. Sure enough, the second jump worked perfectly. It felt incredible. The possibilities raced through his mind. Commuting would be easier. Sports would be transformed. Embarrassing mistakes could simply be undone with a quick reset. Life suddenly looked less fragile and far more forgiving. For the first time in years, Daniel felt genuine excitement about the world around him. The ordinary rules of life had been replaced by something playful and unpredictable. The daily routine that once felt so rigid now seemed open to endless experimentation. But stories that begin with wonder often carry hidden consequences. In the structure of the hero's journey, this moment is called the call to adventure. It's the point where the normal world cracks open and invites the hero into something unfamiliar. At first the invitation feels exciting, almost too good to be true. Daniel didn't know it yet, but this strange change in reality wasn't just a fun glitch in physics. It was the beginning of a much bigger test. The world adapted faster than anyone expected. At first, the strange new rules of reality felt like a global experiment, something exciting and slightly unbelievable. Within hours, videos flooded the internet showing people discovering abilities that once belonged only in video games. In New York City, commuters casually double-jumped over subway turnstiles, laughing as they skipped long ticket lines. In parks and city streets, runners began testing how high they could jump before their stamina bars emptied. What started as confusion quickly transformed into curiosity, and curiosity soon became a kind of global excitement. Daniel watched it unfold with the same mixture of fascination and disbelief that everyone else felt. News channels tried to explain the phenomenon, but even scientists seemed unsure what was happening. The laws of physics had clearly changed overnight, yet everything else in the world remained perfectly normal. Buildings stood where they always had, traffic lights worked, and coffee still tasted the same. The only difference was that people now moved through the world with abilities that seemed impossible just a day earlier. Office life changed almost immediately. In conference rooms across cities, employees began experimenting with something they jokingly called save points. Before important presentations, they would pause, mentally marking the moment as if they could restart from that exact spot if things went wrong. If someone stumbled over their words or forgot an important slide, they simply reset and tried again. It was awkward at first, but also strangely empowering. For the first time, mistakes felt temporary rather than permanent. Athletes were among the first to take full advantage of the new rules. In training centers and sports arenas, coaches watched in disbelief as players performed jumps that would have shattered world records only days earlier. Basketball players soared above hoops with ease. Gymnasts pushed the limits of gravity with movements that once seemed physically impossible. It was thrilling to watch, though slightly unsettling as well. The boundary between effort and achievement suddenly looked very different. For everyday people, the biggest change wasn't physical ability, it was psychological. Failure had always carried consequences. A mistake at work could damage a reputation. A bad decision might take months or years to correct. But now, those consequences felt softer. Embarrassment could be undone. Small accidents reset themselves. Even awkward social moments could be replayed until they felt just right. At first, This felt like a gift. Daniel noticed it during his own workday. Normally he would prepare carefully before speaking during meetings, choosing his words with caution. But now he felt strangely relaxed. If he said something wrong, he could simply reset and try again. That safety net made him more confident, even playful. Conversations felt lighter. People laughed more easily when mistakes happened, knowing those mistakes could simply disappear. The world, in a sense, had become more forgiving. But Daniel also noticed something else, a subtle shift in how people approached effort. When mistakes lose their consequences, the pressure to prepare carefully also fades. Deadlines started feeling less urgent. Some colleagues became more casual about responsibilities because they believed there would always be another chance to fix things later. At first, it seemed harmless. After all, who wouldn't enjoy a life where stress was reduced and every failure could be undone? The new physics of reality made everyday challenges feel more like puzzles than risks. People experimented constantly, testing how far they could push the strange new rules. For Daniel, the experience was both exciting and strangely comforting. The pressure he once felt about getting everything right had disappeared overnight. He realized he was thinking the same thing many people around the world were beginning to believe. If mistakes no longer mattered, success should be simple. And for a while, it truly seemed that way. But this is where the story quietly began to shift. At first, the new rules of reality felt like a gift to everyone. Mistakes could be undone, embarrassing moments could be reset, and small accidents no longer carried serious consequences. Life seemed easier, lighter, and far less stressful. For a while, people celebrated this strange change as if the world had finally become fair. But Daniel started noticing something subtle that others seemed to ignore. When failure loses its consequences, something else slowly disappears too: urgency. At his office, the atmosphere began to change. Deadlines that once pushed teams to work efficiently now felt flexible, almost optional. After all, if something went wrong, people could simply reset and try again. Meetings stretched longer than usual because no one felt pressure to get things right the first time. Colleagues began experimenting more and preparing less. Projects that once took careful planning now moved forward in a strangely casual way. At first, Daniel thought it was harmless. People were simply enjoying their newfound freedom. But as weeks passed, he realized something deeper was happening. Without real consequences, effort began to feel less necessary. Why prepare carefully when you could just try again later? The same pattern appeared outside the office as well. Friends postponed important decisions because they believed there would always be another opportunity. People delayed difficult conversations, avoided risks, and treated challenges like temporary inconveniences rather than meaningful tests. The world had become more playful. But it had also become less focused. Daniel noticed the change in himself too. Normally he would spend time preparing for presentations, reviewing his ideas carefully before sharing them with colleagues. But now he felt less motivated to plan ahead. If something went wrong, he could simply reset the moment and try again. At first, this felt relaxing. But after a while, it began to feel strangely empty. Without the possibility of real failure, success didn't feel quite as rewarding. Achievements that once brought satisfaction now felt temporary, almost artificial. When every mistake could be erased, progress started to lose its meaning. That realization made Daniel uncomfortable. One evening, while walking home through the quiet streets of London, he watched people casually testing their new abilities. A group of teenagers jumped repeatedly across a small bridge, laughing as they experimented with gravity. A cyclist intentionally crashed into a curb just to see how the reset would work. Everyone seemed entertained. Yet Daniel felt something completely different. For the first time since the strange change in reality began, he felt fear. Not the usual fear of failure. Not the anxiety of making a mistake. But something deeper and more unsettling. He felt the fear of a life where nothing truly mattered. Because if every decision could be undone, every risk removed, and every failure erased, then what made any choice meaningful in the first place? This realization marked the true beginning of Daniel's hero's journey. In storytelling, this stage is known as Act 2, the moment when the hero understands that the real challenge isn't what they first believed. At the beginning of the story, the strange new physics seemed like an advantage. A fun, exciting change that made life easier. But Daniel was beginning to understand the hidden cost. The problem wasn't the strange physics of the world. The real problem was human nature. When people no longer face consequences, they also stop valuing effort. Without the risk of failure, courage loses its purpose. Without the pressure of deadlines, ambition begins to fade. For Daniel, this realization created a new kind of urgency. Not urgency to succeed quickly, but urgency to understand what truly gives life its meaning. Because the more he observed the world around him, the more he began to suspect something unsettling. The greatest challenge wasn't learning how to live with these new rules of reality. The greatest challenge was learning how to stay motivated in a world where nothing forced you to try your best. In storytelling terms, this moment represents Act 2 of the hero's journey, the stage where tension rises and the hero begins to understand that the real problem isn't what it first appeared to be. At the beginning of Daniel's story, the strange physics of the world seemed exciting. Double jumps, instant respawns, and the ability to undo mistakes felt like an incredible advantage. It looked as if life had suddenly become easier for everyone. But as days passed, Daniel began to see something deeper. The real issue wasn't the strange change in physics. The real issue was how people were responding to it. Without real stakes, ambition slowly began to fade. Daniel noticed it first at work. Before the change, his team had taken deadlines seriously. Everyone prepared carefully for meetings, double-checked their work, and tried their best to avoid mistakes. But once people realized they could reset small failures, their behavior shifted. Presentations became less organized. Preparation felt less important. Some colleagues even joked about trying risky ideas during meetings because they could always reload the moment if things went wrong. At first, this seemed harmless. In fact, it even made the workplace feel more relaxed. People laughed more. They experimented with ideas they might have avoided before. But over time, Daniel noticed something surprising. Productivity began to slow down. Projects that once required focus and discipline now stretched on for longer than expected. The absence of consequences had quietly removed the pressure that once motivated people to perform at their best. This pattern didn't just appear in the office. It appeared everywhere. Friends delayed difficult decisions because they knew they could always try again later. Athletes practiced less intensely because mistakes during training could simply reset themselves. Even everyday conversations changed. People became less careful with their words because awkward moments could easily be undone. The world had become more forgiving, but it had also become less driven. Daniel realized that something important had disappeared from everyday life, the sense that choices truly mattered. When people believe they can fix any mistake instantly, they stop treating decisions with the same level of care. One evening, Daniel sat alone in his apartment thinking about everything he had observed over the past few weeks. At first, he had celebrated the new rules of reality just like everyone else. The ability to undo failure felt like freedom. But now he was beginning to see the hidden cost of that freedom. Without consequences, courage begins to lose its meaning. Courage only exists when there is something to risk. If a person can never truly fail, then bravery becomes unnecessary. Risk disappears, and with it disappears the excitement of trying something difficult. Daniel thought back to moments in his life when he had felt genuinely proud of himself. Finishing an important project. Delivering a successful presentation. Solving a challenging problem at work. Each of those achievements had something in common. They required effort, preparation, and the possibility of failure. If those moments had been completely safe, would they have felt as meaningful? The answer, Daniel realized, was no. Achievements feel satisfying because failure is possible. The risk of getting something wrong is what makes success feel valuable. When that risk disappears, the reward begins to feel hollow. This realization changed the way Daniel looked at the strange new world around him. What once seemed like an incredible advantage now looked more complicated. The glitch in reality hadn't simply removed failure, it had also removed the pressure that pushes people to grow. For the first time since the change happened, Daniel felt a new kind of urgency. Not urgency to win. Not urgency to compete. But urgency to understand how to live meaningfully in a world where failure could no longer force people to try their best. One evening, after another strange day in this newly altered world, Daniel climbed the stairs to the rooftop of his apartment building in London. From there he could see the city stretching endlessly into the night, streets glowing with traffic lights, buildings shining with office windows, and people moving across rooftops with a kind of playful confidence that had never existed before. Some were casually jumping between buildings just for fun, using the strange new physics like a playground. Others tested how high they could leap before their stamina bars drained. Laughter echoed between rooftops as if the entire city had suddenly turned into a giant video game. At first glance, it looked incredible. People were doing things that once belonged only in digital worlds. Someone nearby jumped 3 times in midair before landing perfectly on the next building. A group of friends practiced risky rooftop leaps, knowing that if they fell, they would simply respawn moments earlier without injury. The fear that normally kept people cautious had disappeared almost entirely. Daniel leaned against the edge of the rooftop and watched quietly. For a while, he felt the same excitement everyone else did. After all, this was the kind of freedom people had imagined for years. The ability to undo mistakes, avoid serious consequences, and retry difficult situations again and again. In theory, it sounded like the perfect system for success. But as Daniel looked across the skyline, something about the scene felt strangely empty. The people jumping between buildings were laughing, but their excitement felt temporary, almost shallow. Their risks no longer carried real danger. Their achievements no longer required true effort. When falling no longer meant failure, the thrill of success started to feel artificial. That realization sat heavily in Daniel's mind. For the first time since the strange changes in reality began, he saw the world differently. What once seemed like an incredible advantage now looked like a quiet trap. The ability to reset every mistake had removed something essential from life, the weight of choice. Without real consequences, decisions lost their importance. Daniel thought about his own behavior during the past few weeks. He had started taking shortcuts at work because mistakes could easily be undone. He had delayed important decisions because he believed there would always be another chance. Even his motivation had changed. The pressure to perform had faded because failure no longer felt permanent. In a strange way, the new rules of reality had made life easier, but also less meaningful. Standing on that rooftop, Daniel realized something important about the hero's journey. Every story needs real stakes. Heroes grow because they face challenges that cannot be undone. Their choices matter because the outcome is uncertain. Without risk, there is no courage. Without difficulty, there is no transformation. And that's when Daniel made a quiet but powerful decision. He would stop using the advantages of this strange new world. No more respawning after mistakes. No more resetting difficult conversations. No more saving progress before every challenge. Instead, he would live as if the rules of the old world still applied. If he failed, he would accept it. If something went wrong, he would learn from it instead of erasing it. It wasn't the easiest choice. In fact, it was probably the hardest decision he had made since the strange changes began. While everyone else around him enjoyed the safety of endless retries, Daniel chose to face life with the same uncertainty people had lived with before. But strangely enough, that decision gave him a sense of control he hadn't felt in weeks. Because real progress, he realized, requires real effort. Real effort requires real risk. And real risk is what makes success feel meaningful. As Daniel looked out over the glowing skyline of London, the laughter of rooftop jumpers still echoed through the night. But for the first time since the world had changed, he felt something stronger than excitement. He felt clarity. The strange new physics of the world might allow people to escape failure. But Daniel had just chosen something far more powerful. He had chosen to earn his victories the hard way. When Daniel decided to stop relying on the strange shortcuts the world had suddenly offered, he didn't expect his life to improve so quickly. At first, the decision felt almost uncomfortable. Everywhere he looked, people were using the new rules of reality to make life easier. They reset mistakes, avoided consequences, and repeated situations until they achieved perfect outcomes. Compared to that, Daniel's choice seemed unnecessary, even a little foolish. But something inside him knew that if he continued depending on those shortcuts, he would slowly lose the sense of progress that once made effort worthwhile. The first place he noticed the difference was at work. Normally, Daniel had become used to resetting small mistakes during meetings or presentations. But now he resisted the temptation. If he said something wrong or forgot an important detail, he simply accepted it and moved forward. At first, this approach felt risky. The safety net of instant correction was always there, quietly waiting to be used. Yet the more he avoided it, the more focused he became. Without the option to erase mistakes, preparation suddenly mattered again. Daniel began planning his presentations carefully, reviewing ideas before meetings and thinking more deeply about the projects he worked on. The pressure returned, but instead of feeling overwhelming, it sharpened his attention. He noticed that when he worked with real effort and real uncertainty, the results felt far more satisfying. The same change appeared in other parts of his life as well. Conversations with friends became more meaningful because he knew he couldn't simply rewind awkward moments. Decisions carried more weight because they couldn't be undone instantly. Even simple choices, what to say, what to do, what risks to take, started to feel important again. Fear returned too, but it was different from the fear he remembered before the world changed. Previously, fear had often held him back. It whispered doubts about whether he was capable enough or prepared enough to succeed. But now, fear worked differently. Instead of stopping him, it reminded him to take things seriously. It encouraged him to prepare, to focus, and to give his best effort when it mattered most. Daniel slowly realized something that many people overlook. Fear is not always the enemy. In the right balance, it can become a powerful form of motivation. It pushes people to grow, to learn, and to face challenges they might otherwise avoid. In the structure of the hero's journey, this stage represents the transformation. The hero doesn't just overcome an external obstacle, they gain a deeper understanding of themselves. For Daniel, the obstacle had never been the strange physics of the world. The real challenge was understanding what makes effort meaningful. The ability to erase failure might sound like freedom, but it quietly removes the pressure that encourages growth. Without the possibility of getting things wrong, people lose the motivation to improve. By choosing to live without those shortcuts, Daniel rediscovered something surprisingly powerful: responsibility. Responsibility for his choices. Responsibility for his efforts. Responsibility for the direction of his own life. And with that responsibility came a new sense of confidence. Not the easy confidence that comes from knowing mistakes can be undone, but the deeper confidence that grows from facing uncertainty and still moving forward. Day by day, Daniel felt more connected to the work he was doing and the life he was building. The world around him still followed the strange new rules of respawns and resets, but his own path had returned to something more authentic. Because the most meaningful victories are never the easiest ones. They are the ones that require courage, effort, and the willingness to face failure without the promise of an instant reset. The strange truth Daniel eventually discovered was something most people rarely stop to think about: the limitations of reality are not obstacles. In many ways, they are the very things that give life meaning. When deadlines exist, people feel urgency. When risks are present, courage has a purpose. When failure is possible, growth becomes real. Without those elements, life may feel easier, but it also becomes strangely empty. Daniel began to understand this idea slowly, almost reluctantly. For weeks, the world around him had been celebrating the new rules of reality. People enjoyed the ability to undo mistakes and reset awkward moments. Businesses adapted quickly, turning small failures into quick do-overs. Athletes experimented with impossible movements, and everyday commuters treated gravity like a suggestion rather than a law. On the surface, everything looked exciting and full of possibility. But beneath that excitement, something important had quietly disappeared. Effort had started to lose its meaning. Daniel noticed it most clearly in the way people talked about their goals. Before the change, ambition had always carried a sense of urgency. People worked hard because time was limited and opportunities didn't last forever. But now, that pressure had softened. If something didn't work out today, it could simply be reset tomorrow. The stakes were lower, and with lower stakes came lower commitment. At first, this felt harmless, almost relaxing. After all, who wouldn't want a life where mistakes could be corrected instantly? Yet Daniel began to see that progress itself was slowing down. Projects that once moved quickly now dragged on. Decisions were postponed because people believed they always had another chance. Without real consequences, the motivation to act decisively faded. One afternoon, while walking through the busy streets of London, Daniel watched a group of office workers experimenting with their new abilities during a lunch break. One of them jumped over a park bench repeatedly, laughing each time they landed. Another intentionally tripped just to trigger a reset and start over. Everyone seemed entertained. But Daniel couldn't stop thinking about how different things felt. Before the change, a simple challenge, like learning a new skill or solving a difficult problem, carried a sense of accomplishment once it was completed. The satisfaction came from knowing that failure had been possible. That risk gave success its emotional weight. Now, that feeling was harder to find. If a mistake could be erased instantly, then success no longer required the same level of perseverance. The world had become more forgiving, but it had also become less demanding. And that's when Daniel realized something important about the nature of purpose. Purpose doesn't come from ease. It comes from effort. People feel proud of their achievements not because those achievements are easy, but because they require persistence. Overcoming difficulty is what gives progress its meaning. When every path becomes simple, the journey itself begins to lose its value. Daniel thought about this idea as he watched the city move around him. Cars flowed through traffic. Pedestrians crossed streets. Office buildings reflected the afternoon sunlight across the skyline. On the surface, life looked exactly the same as it always had. But the deeper structure of life, the invisible system of effort, risk, and reward, had changed dramatically. If life truly worked like a video game, Daniel realized, the biggest challenge wouldn't be survival or success. The biggest challenge would be maintaining purpose in a world where nothing forced people to try their hardest. And perhaps that was the real lesson hidden inside the strange changes to reality. Sometimes the very things people wish they could remove, pressure, deadlines, uncertainty, are the same things that make life meaningful in the first place. Without them, life might feel easier. But it might also feel less worth living. So the next time life feels difficult, remember this: the very rules that make progress hard are the same rules that make it valuable. And if you enjoy stories that explore ambition, psychology, and the hidden lessons inside everyday life, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the most powerful adventure isn't escaping reality, it's understanding why it works the way it does.